Welcome, one and all, as we begin our third topic in the course of ethics. The topic is divine command theory. We've actually already seen this one slightly before in our introductory classes. We're going to take a closer look. This is the first one that I said deserves a closer look. So, let's just quickly, because we've already seen this before, let's knock out some of the vocabulary regarding divine command theory, namely the source. Do you remember what the source of divine command theory is? If you said the Bible or the Word of God or something like that, well, you're close, but that's not quite what we're looking for. The source of morality, according to divine command theory, is God Himself, is the actual divine being. God is the source of morality, but when it comes to the standard, that is the test that we use to determine whether or not something is morally acceptable or perhaps morally forbidden, then that would be God's commands. And that's where, if you wanted to, you could say, depending on which particular religion you're considering this from, you might say that would be the Bible, that might be the Quran, that might be the Torah or the Tanakh, or various other sources that one might believe to be the commands of God. So we've got the source, we've got the standard, and unlike the first two topics that we've looked at, namely cultural relativism and expressivism, divine command theory is unapologetically objective. Remember, that just means it says there are at least some moral facts, the truth of certain moral claims hold regardless of human opinion. That is to say that something, if it's wrong, it doesn't change based upon human opinion. It's going to be wrong regardless of human opinion, or something that's right will be required regardless of human opinion. So we've seen all these before, the vocabulary, and we can get into divine command theory in a second, but, and this is part of the reason I like to come back and do a closer look. I think the common terminology today is to do a deep dive into divine command theory, because it will also, on the way to it, we're going to have to come up with some other very interesting aspects of ethics that we might not have gotten to otherwise. So before we get to the argument for divine command theory, I want to talk a little bit about moral values and something else called moral duties. Now, I'm going to give you the definition for each of these, and I warn you ahead of time, they're going to look very, very similar. It will be difficult to tell the difference between what a moral value is supposed to include and what a moral duty would include, at least at first. I hope to make this clear. So, what are moral values? Moral values determine whether something is morally good or bad. Oh, well, that doesn't seem so hard. This seems pretty easy. All right, next one. What about those moral duties? Yes, the moral duties. Well, those determine whether something is morally right or wrong. That's the difference. Got the picture? You see the difference? And you're probably saying, well, I see a difference, or at least a distinction. Values talk about something or determine whether something is morally good or bad, but moral duties determine whether something is morally right or wrong. Good, bad, right, wrong. Aren't these basically saying the exact same thing using just slightly different words? Isn't this what some philosophers like to call a distinction without a difference? And it will look like it's a distinction without a difference, but that's not the case. There's actually a very subtle yet very important difference here. Something can be good without necessarily being morally right. Something can be morally bad without necessarily being morally wrong. There is a difference, and this is a difference that ethicists need to take note of. So let's see if I can explain this a little bit. I wonder how many of you, and if we were actually physically in the classroom, I would ask this of you, how many of you either have sometime in the past or hope one day to work in the medical field? Doctor, nurse, whatever. How many of you either have or one day hope to work in the medical profession? Go ahead and raise your hand. And if we were in the classroom, I'd probably see a majority, at least half, if not more than half, of the hands going up. Maybe you yourself listening are mentally raising a hand now saying, oh yeah, I've done it. Oh, I hope to one day. Well, in the case of this example, it would be morally good. That is to say, it would be valuable for you to become, say, just to keep it simple, a doctor. Why would that be morally good? Well, we could come up with some relatively easy reasons. For one thing, you would be able to save lives that might have otherwise not made it. These people might have died. You will be able to alleviate suffering that people don't have to experience. You may be able to make it where grandparents actually live to see and spend time with grandchildren who, if not for you and your medical treatment, they may have never seen them. We can come up with all sorts of reasons why this would be morally good, why it would be valuable for you to become a good doctor and all the good things that could come from it. However, just because it's good does not mean that you're morally obligated, does not mean that you have any moral duty to become a doctor. So you see, to say that something is good doesn't mean that you must do it. It just means that it's nice. It means that it's good. There is value in it, but it doesn't mean that you have an obligation to do it. It doesn't mean you have any such duty to perform it. So as we've already said, it might be very good for you to become a medical professional. It might be just as good or very good for you to become a firefighter, or for that matter, to become a CEO or an attorney or a lawyer or well, I don't know, maybe not a lawyer. I don't know if that's good or not, but a petroleum engineer, a on-site inspector, all of these professions, with the possible exception of the lawyer, I don't know, they would all be morally good. We come up with reasons why it would be valuable, why it would be good for you to pursue that profession, but you're not required to do any of them. And it's a good thing that just because something is good, that doesn't mean that you're required to do it. For if that were the case, that would mean that you would actually be required to do all of these things. And no one can do that. So that's all that it means for something to be morally good. It would have value that comes from it, morally speaking. Now let's contrast that with a moral duty. So here's kind of an algebraic way to explain what a moral duty is. I have a moral duty to do something. And again, you see the X here. You can fill that in with whatever makes sense to you. I have a moral duty to love my neighbor. I have a moral duty to give to charity. I have a moral duty to take care of my children, whatever it may be, if it would be wrong not to do that thing. So a moral duty says this is something that you have to do. And if you opt out of it, if you decide not to do it, you have in fact done something morally wrong. So let me give an example here. I take it that most of you have probably been to the campus at Palo Alto. I wonder, have any of you ever seen that little fountain they have back behind the library, back behind the Ozuna building? If you have, you know that it's not particularly deep. You could fall in there and just, stand up and you'd be fine. You'd be out of the water. Well, imagine that one day I'm leaving the campus, and as I'm walking back to my car, I happen to pass by that water fountain, and I hear some splashing coming from that fountain. Now, perhaps I'm getting excited. Perhaps some of you get excited. You think, oh, I can't believe it. They've stocked the fountain with fish. No, they didn't do that. Of course not. As I get a little closer, I say, what's making all that splashing sound? I see that a young toddler has fallen into the fountain and is drowning. Now, again, if you've seen this fountain, you know there's not that much to it. All but the very shortest of toddlers could simply stand up and they'd be okay. But as happens quite a bit to children, and not infrequently to anyone who's not familiar with the water, Junior here, rather than just trying to stand up or to brace himself and push off the the floor of the fountain, Junior here is fighting the water. He's kicking wildly. He's just kind of flailing his arms around, and it's making his head go down lower and his feet come up higher. If he just controlled himself and stood up, he'd be fine. But he's panicked. He's not thinking clearly, and if someone doesn't help him, he's going to drown. He's going to die. I can't believe this. I've never seen anything like this before. Not really, not in real life. I look around, there's no one else around. There's no security, there's no lifeguard on duty by this water fountain. I'm the only one who can help him. Now, guys, I swim fine. But I don't even need to swim. It would be so easy. All I have to do is walk over to that fountain, roll up my sleeves a little bit, reach in, grab him by the shirt collar, haul him out, just make sure he's breathing, and then turn him over to some security, to some a responsible person, some professional who can make sure he gets back to his parents or wherever he belongs. And I have just saved a life. I have just done something of great moral value. It was good. It was valuable for me to save Junior. I think most of you would probably agree. Say, why was it good? Well, because now the parents, the family, the loved ones, the grandparents are not going to have to go through the pain and the sorrow and the agony of having lost a child in such a tragic manner. Junior here is not going to have the pain that goes with drowning to death and the fright and the scare that comes from that as such a young child. The school hopefully won't have to worry about a lawsuit since I've saved his life. Well, and I don't know. It depends on those lawyers that we were worried about earlier. But for all these reasons and countless others we could no doubt come up with, it would be morally good for me to just take a few moments out of my day along my way home and save Junior's life. But here's my question for you. Okay, it's good, but do I have a duty to save him? Do I have a moral obligation to save him? Or could I just walk by and ignore him? For you see, there's one thing I haven't told you yet as I'm walking out to my car and getting ready to leave. The lunch special ends in about 8 minutes, and I'm already really cutting it close. Pretty soon I'll have to pay an extra $1.35 to get the... Have I told you what the lunch special is? Guys, it's the enchilada plates to die for. And in just a second, the special is going to go away and I'd have to pay full price. Guys, I don't know if any of you have seen me or not, but if any of you have, you know that this professor cannot afford to miss a meal. I just can't. So I guess what I'm asking for you guys, I'm asking for your permission. Would you say that just today, just this one time, considering how high the stakes are, considering how much I could lose, is it all right for me just to walk by Junior and leave him alone? It's not my fault. I didn't throw him in the water. I wasn't the one who should have been watching him. So is it okay if I just walk away and let him drown? We've already said it's good that I save him, but is it right for me to save him? Do I have a duty to save him if I just walk by and let him drown so that I can save $1.50 on an enchilada plate? Have I done something morally wrong? And I imagine that quite a few of you, perhaps the vast majority of you, would say, yes, you have, Hooford. You've done something wrong. When it's so easy to save a life and to prevent this kind of suffering and anguish for so many people, it would be wrong for you to turn your back and let this innocent person, this innocent little child, die just for you to save $1.35 on some enchiladas. That would be wrong, Hooford, and if you do it, you've done something morally wrong. I suspect most of you would probably say, no, Hooford, this isn't just good. It is, but it's not only a good thing. In addition to that, it's also right. You actually have a requirement, a moral duty to intervene and to save that child because it costs you so little to do something so important. Maybe there's a few of you who don't quite go that far. Maybe there's a few of you who say, yeah, it'd be nice, it'd be considered, it'd be good, but you don't have to do it. If you really want the enchiladas that bad, walk on by. You haven't done anything wrong. It's not your fault. So for those of you who might be holding out saying, no, you ain't got no duty to do this, just walk on by. I could change the story a little bit. I could say that as I was walking out one day, I saw this young toddler who wasn't in the water, hadn't fallen into the fountain, but was rather just kind of leaning over the side looking at it, enjoying it. And suppose I come up behind him, look around, there's no one watching, and I just kind of pick him up and push him over into the water, and I hold his head down underneath so that he drowns. Hooford, why would you do that? Oh, because I love the sound toddlers make when they're drowning. The bubbles are just so divine. I don't know what it is, but Suppose I ask, is it okay for me to drown toddlers for fun? Is there still anyone who would say, no, nothing wrong with that. You haven't done anything wrong if you do that? Maybe. I kind of hope not, but probably with that one, I've probably got everyone to say, okay, Hooford, you can't cross that line. It's not okay. You've done something wrong if you go around drowning children for fun. Okay. Well, if I have you on either of those, that is, if you said to anyone, if you said, for example, no, Hooford, you have a moral duty to stop and render aid for the drowning child, or at the very least, you have a duty not to go out and drown children for your own bemusement, then you believe in at least one moral duty. You think that it is right for me to stop and help, or in the case of drowning the child for fun, you would say it is wrong to do that, which means you have a duty to render aid, or at the very least a duty not to harm and kill a child for my own entertainment. So that's the difference between a moral value, which says, this is good, but that doesn't mean you must do it, or even, this is bad, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's forbidden. That's the difference between a moral value, good and bad, versus a moral duty, right or wrong. So I hope that makes some sense. I hope you can kind of see the difference there. So as we were saying, if you think, no, Hooford, you cannot drown children for fun, then you believe in at least one moral duty. Don't go around drowning children for fun. So now that we understand what moral duties are, we can kind of explain what the moral law is. Now once you understand moral duties, the moral law is pretty easy. Basically, make a list of all the duties you have, such as don't drown children for fun, and whatever else you think there is, it doesn't really matter. Just put them all together, put them in one book, in one list, and the whole set of them, the whole collection of those duties would be the moral law. The moral law just is whatever all the moral duties are. That's the moral law. So if there is at least one moral duty, then we've got a moral law. All right, so we've talked about moral values, we've talked about moral duties, and however many of those there are, when you put them together, those duties comprise in their entirety the moral law. So with that being the case, we are now ready to go into the argument for divine command theory. So whenever you see DCT, that's just short for divine command theory. Now, in this one, we haven't really all that clearly explained what divine command theory says, what a divine command theorist believes. Usually I try to explain it first and then give the argument for divine command theory. So first just say this is what it says, this is what these people believe. Now, here's why they think they're right, here's why they think that you should believe them. So, since we haven't really pulled those apart yet, let me just give you the arguments, and then after that, we'll come back and we'll try to explain why they think that's the case. So let me give you the argument in premise and conclusion form. Remember, premises are the reasons, and conclusions are the main point that they're trying to convince people to believe. Premise number 1 reads, if an objective moral law exists, then it must come from a moral law giver. In the simplest of sense, this premise is basically saying the law of cause and effect. If there's an effect, there must be a cause for that effect. If there's a book, there must be an author. If there's music, there must have been some sort of music composer. If there's a moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver. Cause and effect is true. So if there's a moral effect, namely an objective moral law, then there must be a cause for that effect, namely a moral lawgiver. Now, just notice so far it didn't say that there is an objective moral law. It just says if there were any such thing, then this is what it would take to get it. The only way you could have this is if you had the second part after the little comma there. But let's look at what the second premise says. It makes a very simple assertion. In fact, there is an objective moral law. It does exist. So if these premises are both true, if it's true that the only way you can get an objective moral law is it has to come from a moral lawgiver, and if there really is an objective moral law, then the conclusion says, therefore, that moral law that they said is real, the moral law must come from a moral lawgiver, and I'm sure you never saw this coming, never would have thought of it with a name like Divine Command Theory, but let me lay it on the line. They believe that moral lawgiver is God. That's the argument. And right now we're just doing the introduction part of the argument. We're just using this to explain exactly what Divine Command Theory believes. This is the example of why they believe that God is the source of morality. So here's what I want to do for just a moment. I want to step aside and I want to give you the opportunity to listen to an actual Divine Command theorist who's going to kind of put these things together and explain why he thinks Divine Command Theory is true. I'll just remind you that when I put video or otherwise audio on these recordings, it tends to be significantly louder than the audio of me just speaking, my voice over the videos. So you might want to turn down the volume just a little bit as I go ahead and play the Divine Command theorist making this argument.
Do you believe that good and evil exist? The answer to this question separates Judeo-Christian values from secular values. Let me offer the clearest possible example: murder. Is murder wrong? Is it evil? Nearly everyone would answer yes, but now I will pose a much harder question. How do you know? I'm sure you think murder is wrong, but how do you know? If I asked you how you know that the earth is round, you would show me photographs from outer space or offer me measurable data. But what photographs could you show? What measurements could you provide that prove that murder or rape or theft is wrong? The fact is, you can't. There are scientific facts, but without God, there are no moral facts. In a secular world, there can only be opinions about morality. They may be personal opinions or society's opinions, but only opinions. Every atheist philosopher I have read or debated on this subject has acknowledged that if there is no God, there is no objective morality. Judeo-Christian values are predicated on the existence of a God of morality. In other words, only if there is a God who says murder is wrong, is murder wrong. Otherwise, all morality is opinion. The entire Western world, what we call Western civilization, is based on this understanding. Now, let me make two things clear. First, this doesn't mean that if you don't believe in God, you can't be a good person. There are plenty of kind and moral individuals who don't believe in God and Judeo-Christian values. But the existence of these good people has nothing to do with the question of whether good and evil really exist if there is no God. Second, there have been plenty of people who believed in God who were not good people. Indeed, more than a few have been evil and have even committed evil in God's name. The existence of God doesn't ensure people will do good. I wish it did. The existence of God only ensures that good and evil objectively exist and are not merely opinions. Without God, we therefore end up with what is known as moral relativism, meaning that morality is not absolute, but only relative to the individual or to the society. Without God, the words good and evil are just another way of saying I like and I don't like. If there is no God, the statement murder is evil is the same as the statement I don't like murder. Now, many will argue that you don't need moral absolutes. People won't murder because they don't want to be murdered. But that argument is just wishful thinking. Hitler, Stalin, and Mao didn't want to be murdered, but that hardly stopped them from murdering about 100 million people. Today, the rejection of Judeo-Christian values and moral absolutes has led to a world of moral confusion. In the New York Times in March 2015, a professor of philosophy confirmed this. He wrote, "What would you say if you found out that our public schools were teaching children that it is not true that it's wrong to kill people for fun? Would you be surprised? I was." The professor then added, "The overwhelming majority of college freshmen view moral claims as mere opinions." So then, whatever you believe about God or religion, here is a fact. Without a God who is the source of morality, morality is just a matter of opinion.
All right, so I don't want to restate everything that the video said. You can obviously go back and look at that again if you like. But here's the main thing that I want to take from it. Remember when he said that divine command theory... Well, let me say this first. The speaker there was looking specifically at divine command theory from a Judeo-Christian perspective or from a Jewish/Christian perspective. And that's fine. You can look at it from pretty much any particular religious perspective you like. For the purposes of this class, however, we're not going to be looking at it specifically from any religious perspective. Not Christian, not Jewish. The purpose of this class is not to take a religious stand for any particular church or any particular religion. It's rather to look at what are the requirements for an objective moral law. So just to clarify, we're not necessarily looking at divine command theory from any particular religious perspective, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise. The next thing I want to bring out, I want to highlight from that video, was how he said, now let me tell you what divine command theory does not say. And this is something that is frequently misunderstood. I have students that kind of jump to this conclusion all the time. I think they hear people say, if you don't believe in God, you're not going to be a good person. You can't be a good and moral person if you don't believe in God. That is not what divine command theory says. You may remember he says, this doesn't mean that you must believe in God. There are plenty of kind, considerate atheists who don't believe in God, yet live very moral lifestyles. He even said, and there are also plenty of people who do believe in God who may live evil lifestyles. So the argument is not to say that you must believe in God in order to be moral or in order to be good. What the argument is saying is, if there is no God, then there is no moral law. Rather, it's just opinion. So it's not, can you behave well if you don't believe in God? It doesn't matter what you believe. The question is, where does good and evil come from? If there is no God, what would the source of morality be? Basically, divine command theory is saying that God is the only reasonable source for an objective moral law, and if there were no such being, then that means there would be no objective moral law. That is the heart of divine command theory. Now, just very briefly, you might remember from what we've said before that if you disagree with a conclusion, and you can always disagree with a conclusion, you never have to accept it. You may look and say, I do not accept this conclusion that the moral law must have come from a moral lawgiver, and that moral lawgiver must be God. You can disagree with that. You can deny that. Do you remember how you do that? From a logical argument. If you want to disagree with the conclusion below the line, then what you have to do is you have to pick a premise above the line and show how it's either wrong, and if you show that it's wrong, you have beaten the argument, or at least show how it is suspicious. Show how it might be wrong, and therefore, however suspicious that premise is, the conclusion is equally suspicious. It's kind of like the idea that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. In the same way, an argument or the conclusion of an argument is only as convincing as its weakest or perhaps most suspicious premise. So, do we have any good reasons to believe that these premises are true? To believe, for existence, that you can only have an objective moral law if it comes from a moral lawgiver. Or on the other hand, that there really is an objective moral law. So, for example, you might believe the first one. You might say, for example, oh yeah, I think that's right. I believe in cause and effect. I believe if there's a movie, there must have been a movie maker. I believe if there's a song, there must have been a songwriter or song composer. And I believe if there's an objective moral law, it must have come from a moral lawgiver. You might agree with this one, but you might say, however, I don't think that there is any such objective moral law. Or you might flip it. You might say, of course I believe there's an objective moral law. Of course I believe drowning children for fun is morally wrong anywhere, anytime, regardless of human opinion. But I don't think you need a moral lawgiver to get that. You could question either one of these premises. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to now put on a different divine command theorist, and he's going to defend first premise number one and then premise number two, so you can see, so you can hear for yourself why the divine command theorist thinks you should believe these particular reasons for this conclusion.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
So that wasn't too different from what we saw in the first video. It basically said, if there's no moral lawgiver, then all we really have is a bunch of people's opinion. I may have an opinion, you may have an opinion, the person across the street may have an opinion. But what makes my opinion any more correct than yours or from the guy across the street? And ultimately, people are going to say, I don't see what makes anyone's opinion better than anyone else's. Kind of like the ice cream example. Just because you like vanilla and I like chocolate, who's to say who's correct and who is incorrect? There needs to be something above mere human opinion to make that so. There has to be something that makes that true, and human opinion is not enough to make it true. So someone might say, like I indicated earlier, sure, I believe it. If we're talking about an objective moral law, it's got to come from somewhere. There's got to be a cause for it. And the only thing that makes sense in terms of causing an objective moral law to exist is a moral lawgiver. Just like the only thing that makes sense in terms of causing a story or a book to exist is an author. However, someone might say, just because I think a moral lawgiver is a requirement for an objective moral law to exist, that doesn't mean I believe that any such moral law really does exist. Just because that's how it would have to be for the objective moral law to exist doesn't mean that I believe there is any such objective moral law. Maybe I don't. Maybe I think there really is no such thing. There's more than just a few people who would deny premise number 2, and you might be inclined to deny it with them. So why would the divine command theorists say that you should accept that there is an objective moral law? Why would they say that we should believe premise 2 is correct? I'm going to step aside again and let them explain that point.
But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5.
So we've seen how the divine command theorists might defend both of these premises. And in that last one, to summarize, they say, there are going to be some people that reject it, and if they do, there's really nothing that we can say about that. But there's also something that they can't have anything to say about, and that is they can't condemn anything as morally wrong, at least not really. And they gave the examples of racial discrimination. They gave the examples of child abuse. They gave the examples of terrorism. I've given the example of drowning children for fun or kicking puppies for fun. If someone wants to say, no, that's wrong, some of those things you just can't do, then the divine command theorist is going to say, oh, now, do you think that that's really wrong? Or is it just, in your opinion, it's wrong? There's nothing really wrong with it. You just don't happen to like it. You just don't happen to approve of it. If you're going to say, I'm sorry, there is no objective moral law, then you can't say that any of those things or anything else is truly wrong. You cannot say that anything is actually morally forbidden. The most you can say is, I don't happen to like it. Some other people don't happen to like it. It's not particularly fashionable right now, but you can't really say it's wrong. You can't really say that's something that neither you nor anyone else should ever do. In fact, if there is no objective moral law, then you'd probably say, as soon as it becomes popular, of course you can do it. Nothing wrong with it. Now, not many people are willing to bite that bullet. Not many people are willing to say, nothing is truly forbidden. All things are permissible because there is no such moral law. Most people will say, for example, drowning toddlers for fun is truly wrong. And then the divine command theorist is going to say, really? All right, then if you think that drowning toddlers for fun is truly morally wrong, that means you believe in an objective moral law. Yeah, I guess I do. Okay, good. So if you believe in that objective moral law, it obviously had to come from something. There has to be some cause for this effect. Where do you think it come from? Well, that's where we can help you. If an objective moral law exists, then there's only one explanation. It must come from a moral law giver. That is what divine command theory believes and teaches. And that, the reasons that we've just seen, the videos that we've looked at, that explains why they think it's true and why they think that reasonable people should agree with them. So as we're winding down towards the end of our first video, which kind of explains and defends divine command theory, and just so you know, when we come back next time, we're going to look at objections, several of them, against the theory. Let me kind of start off by asking one, and I'll leave you to think about it a little bit. Let us suppose, and I'm not saying that you necessarily believe this, but let's suppose that someone looks at the first premise here and says, let's see, if an objective moral law exists, then it must come from a moral law giver. Do I believe that? Well, I believe in cause and effect. That is the whole basis of the scientific enterprise, and I think it applies here. Yes, I accept that if a moral law exists, it must come from a moral law giver. Suppose that someone does that. Number two, an objective moral law really does exist. Is that true? Am I going to accept that? Well, I know there are some people that don't accept it. I know some people question it. But if in order to give that up, I would have to say there's nothing wrong with what Hitler did. There's nothing wrong with the Holocaust. That people who go around abusing children, they're not doing anything wrong. Some people like to play card games. Some people like to watch sports. Some people like to abuse children. There's not really any difference. I can't do that. I can't go that far. So yes, I'm going to put another check mark here. Yes, an objective moral law does exist. And now the divine command theorist says, we've got him. He's on our side. He's accepted the first premise. He's accepted the second premise. So now he is locked in. He's got to say, therefore, the moral law must come from a moral law giver. But stop right there. I've accepted that there is a moral law. And I've accepted the only way to get such an objective moral law is if it comes from a moral law giver. But why do I need to accept that this moral law giver must be God? I mean, maybe it is, but does it have to be? Could there be some other moral law giver different from God? I mean, let me ask you guys this. Do you see God anywhere above the line in either premise number 1 or 2? And the answer, of course, is no, it's not there. So when they put God in the conclusion, there's actually more information in the conclusion than there is in all the premises above the line. It's like the divine command theorist was being so careful, so systematic, talking about cause and effect, explaining why we must believe there's an objective moral law, or at least why many people do. And it all made perfect sense until at the very end they said, and by the way, that moral lawgiver must be God. Any questions? Okay, let's go. Goodbye. Well, no, I don't think we should let them get away with that. Why does the moral lawgiver have to be God? Why couldn't it possibly be someone else? Just for example, how about the Supreme Court? Or maybe the legislator? You know, the people that actually make the laws? Or what about society itself? I mean, here's what I'm asking. What do you think? Is it possible that we could be the moral lawgivers that we've been looking for? Why must the moral lawgiver be God? Does the divine command theorist have a good explanation for that? Or are they just picking the one that they like and saying that must be? Well, that's the question I'm going to leave you with. Why does it have to be God? And we'll come back and we'll see if the divine command theorist has an answer for that next time. We'll look through several objections.